In a quiet neighborhood in Piedmont, Alabama, nothing about the morning of April 17th suggested it would end in tragedy. It was an ordinary day in a place where life tends to move slowly, where neighbors know each other, and where children are expected to be safe behind familiar doors. But behind one of those doors, something went terribly wrong. At first, there was only confusion. A family searching their home, calling out a child's name, expecting a response that never came. What began as concern quickly turned into panic when one of the children could not be found inside the house. In a matter of moments, that search spilled outside, an ordinary act of a worried parent that would lead to a discovery no one should ever have to make. When police arrived, the situation was already shifting from a missing persons case into something far more devastating. Officers would soon confirm what the family feared but could not accept. A 10-year-old girl, Katheryn Bigbee, had been found with fatal injuries inside her own home. What makes this case even harder to comprehend isn't just what happened, but who it involved. Authorities later confirmed that a juvenile suspect had been taken into custody and charged in connection with her death. A child accused in the death of another child, an unsettling detail that has left an entire community struggling to understand how such a situation could unfold in a place like this. At Piedmont Elementary School, where Katheryn was known for her bright personality and quiet kindness, grief quickly turned into a shared sorrow. Teachers and classmates described a child who brought energy into every room she entered, a presence now reduced to memories and mourning. But beyond the tributes and the early police statements, one question now hangs heavily over this case. What really happened inside that home, and how did it come to this? And the answer, as investigators continue to piece together the events of that day, is only beginning to emerge. As investigators secured the scene that afternoon, the home in Piedmont was no longer just a family residence. It had become a sealed point of investigation, marked by caution tape, quiet urgency, and the controlled movement of law enforcement personnel trying to preserve whatever evidence remained. Inside, every detail mattered. Every room was treated as a potential piece of a larger puzzle. Officers moved carefully, documenting, photographing, and collecting information that could explain how a routine day had turned into a devastating loss. Outside, neighbors gathered at a distance, trying to make sense of what they were hearing in fragments: police activity, emergency response, and the unsettling confirmation that a child had been found dead in her own home. For a community like Piedmont, where violent incidents involving children are rare, the news landed like a shockwave. People struggled not only with grief, but with disbelief. How could something like this happen here? And more importantly, how could it happen inside a place that was supposed to represent safety? According to early statements from police, the situation began as a missing child report. The parents, realizing that one of their children could not be located inside the house, initially believed she may have simply stepped outside or wandered nearby. That assumption quickly collapsed as the search expanded and concern deepened. It was not long before the search moved outdoors, a decision driven by panic and urgency that every parent understands instinctively when a child cannot be found. But what they discovered outside the home changed everything. Authorities later confirmed that Katheryn Bigbee, just 10 years old, was found with fatal injuries. The Calhoun County coroner determined that she had been stabbed. That confirmation transformed the case from a missing persons search into a homicide investigation, triggering a full-scale response from law enforcement. In situations like this, investigators often work backwards. They begin at the moment of discovery and attempt to reconstruct the final hours, sometimes minutes, of a victim's life. Every person who was in or near the home becomes part of that timeline. Every movement, every sound, every interaction is treated as a possible clue. As police secured the scene, attention quickly turned inward to those who were inside the house at the time. Within hours, a juvenile suspect was taken into custody and charged in connection with the murder. Authorities did not release the name consistent with legal protections for minors, but the confirmation alone intensified public attention and concern. A case involving children on both sides of such a violent act is rare, and it immediately raises difficult questions that investigators now must carefully navigate. Unlike adult homicide cases, juvenile investigations involve additional legal legal protections, confidentiality rules, and psychological considerations that can slow the release of information to the public. This often leaves communities in a painful state of uncertainty while investigators work behind the scenes. At the same time, detectives began interviewing family members, first responders, and anyone who had relevant knowledge of the household dynamics. The goal was not just to understand what happened, but to establish context, what led up to the moment everything changed. Inside the home, investigators would have been looking for signs of struggle, patterns of movement, and any evidence that could establish a sequence of events. Was there an argument? Was there a sudden escalation? Or did something occur without warning, in a way that left no time for intervention? These are the questions that typically define the early stages of a homicide investigation, and in a case involving minors, they become even more sensitive. Every detail must be handled with care, not only for legal accuracy, but also because the individuals involved are children whose lives are permanently altered by what has occurred. Outside the investigation, the emotional impact was already spreading through the community. At Piedmont Elementary School, where Katheryn was a student, staff and classmates were confronted with a reality no school is prepared for. The loss of a student is always devastating, but the violent nature of this case added an additional layer of grief and confusion. Teachers described her as a bright, expressive child who brought energy into the classroom. She was known for her enthusiasm, particularly in reading, and for a personality that made her memorable to those around her. In the aftermath, those memories became both a comfort and a source of pain for those trying to process the sudden absence. The school's public message reflected that collective grief, speaking of a sweet little girl whose presence had been a source of joy. But behind those words was an unspoken reality: a classroom now left with an empty seat, a routine disrupted, and children who would now have to confront questions far beyond their years. As news of the arrest spread, speculation naturally followed, though authorities were careful in what they released. In cases involving juveniles, the legal system is designed to protect identity and limit exposure, meaning that much of the public understanding remains incomplete during the early stages. This gap between public curiosity and official silence often creates tension in high-profile cases, especially when the victim is a child. What remains clear, however, is that investigators believe they have identified the individual responsible for Katheryn's death. The focus shifts now from immediate discovery to deeper understanding: what motivated the act, what circumstances allowed it to unfold, and whether there were any warning signs that were missed. In many homicide investigations involving minors, the answers are rarely simple. They often involve layers of emotional, environmental, and psychological factors that do not present themselves immediately. Detectives may examine prior interactions, behavioral history, and any documented concerns that could help explain the events leading up to the tragedy. But at this stage, much of that remains tightly controlled within the investigation. Officials have released only what is necessary to confirm the nature of the case, while withholding details that could compromise the integrity of ongoing inquiries or the legal rights of those involved. For the community of Piedmont, that means living in a space of uncertainty. The facts that are known are already devastating, but the questions that remain unanswered are what continue to linger. And as the investigation moves forward, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is not just a case about what happened inside a single home. It's about understanding how a situation involving children could escalate into something irreversible, and what it reveals about the hidden tensions that can exist, even in the most ordinary environments. Because somewhere in the hours before that discovery, a sequence of events began that no one fully saw coming. As detectives continued building the timeline of events inside the Piedmont home, the focus slowly shifted from the discovery of the tragedy to the question that now mattered most to investigators. Because in cases like this, the truth is rarely found in a single detail. It is reconstructed piece by piece through statements, physical evidence, and the subtle inconsistencies that begin to appear when people try to explain events under pressure. Inside the house, investigators worked to establish the order of movement that day. Who was where and when? Which rooms were occupied? Which areas showed signs of disturbance? Even the smallest details, an object out of place, a door left open, a trail of movement, can become critical in understanding how a situation escalated so quickly and so violently. What makes this case especially difficult is the presence of juvenile suspects on both sides of the investigation. That reality changes everything about how information is processed, released, and interpreted. Authorities must move carefully, ensuring that every conclusion is supported by evidence rather than assumption. Early in the investigation, police confirmed that a juvenile suspect had been taken into custody and charged with murder. That detail alone immediately narrowed the scope of inquiry, but it did not provide answers. Instead, it introduced a new layer of complexity. When the accused is also a minor, investigators are often dealing with a situation that does not follow the patterns seen in adult criminal cases. There's usually no clear motive presented up front, no simple explanation that neatly ties events together. Instead, detectives must look deeper into relationships, interactions, emotional states, and any history that might help explain how tensions escalated to violence. Inside the home that day, it is believed that multiple family members were present. At some point, something shifted. A normal household environment became a scene of panic and confusion. The initial assumption that a child was simply missing inside the home suggested that, at least for a brief period, the situation was not understood to be life-threatening. But that assumption did not hold for long. As the search intensified, the realization that something was seriously wrong began to set in. The decision to search outside the home marked a turning point. It was the moment when hope began to give way to fear, even before the full truth was known. When Katheryn Bigbee was found, the case immediately transitioned from uncertainty to confirmed tragedy. The presence of fatal injuries changed everything about how the scene was handled. Emergency response shifted to investigatory protocol. The home was secured, access was restricted, and every person who had been inside became part of a formal investigative process. At the center of that process was the juvenile suspect, whose custody quickly became a key development in the case. While authorities have not publicly detailed what led to the arrest, the speed at which it occurred suggests that investigators believed there was enough initial evidence or testimony to justify immediate action. In many juvenile homicide cases, early custody decisions are based on witness statements, physical evidence, and immediate investigatory findings at the scene. These early steps are crucial, but they are not final conclusions. They are the beginning of a much longer legal and investigative process. As detectives worked through interviews, attention would have been given to behavioral patterns leading up to the incident. Investigators often look for any signs of escalation, conflict, unusual behavior, or changes in interaction between individuals in the household. Even small details that may seem insignificant at first can later become critical in building a timeline. However, in this case, official information has remained extremely limited, likely due to the involvement of minors and the ongoing investigation. That silence often fuels public speculation, but from an investigative standpoint, it is a necessary part of protecting both the integrity of the case and the legal rights of those involved. Outside the home, the emotional impact continued to spread. At Piedmont Elementary School, grief was no longer an abstract concept, it was immediate and personal. Teachers were faced with explaining loss to children who may not fully understand its permanence. Classrooms became spaces of mourning, reflection, and unanswered questions. Katheryn was remembered not through official reports or legal documents, but through the voices of those who knew her in everyday life. A child who was present, active, and full of personality, now suddenly absent in a way that could not be reversed. For the community, that absence is difficult to process because it interrupts the natural order of expectation. Children are not supposed to become victims of violence, especially not in environments that are supposed to be safe. That disruption is part of what makes this case so emotionally difficult for those following it closely. Meanwhile, investigators continue to work through the structured process of reconstructing events. This includes reviewing forensic evidence, examining any digital records that may exist, and cross-referencing statements to identify inconsistencies or gaps. In modern investigations, even small digital footprints, messages, timestamps, or device activity can help clarify timelines that would otherwise remain uncertain. But as of now, much of that work remains behind the scenes. What the public knows is limited. A child was found dead inside her home, another child has been charged, and an entire community is left trying to understand how such a situation could develop without warning. What the investigators are still working to determine is much more complex. What triggered the escalation? What the interaction between those involved looked like in the moments leading up to the incident, and whether there were any indicators that could have changed the outcome. And beneath all of that lies a deeper question that does not yet have an answer. Whether this was a sudden act or the result of something that had been building quietly before anyone realized the danger. As the investigation moved deeper into its most sensitive phase, detectives began focusing on the final sequence of moments inside the Piedmont home, the narrow window of time between a normal household setting and the devastating outcome that followed. At this stage of a homicide investigation, especially one involving a juvenile suspect and a child victim, every detail is treated with extreme care. The goal is no longer just to identify what happened, but to understand how quickly it escalated and whether there were any intervening moments that could have changed the outcome. Inside the home, investigators worked to reconstruct movement patterns room by room. They examined how people entered and exited spaces, whether there were signs of sudden confrontation, and whether anything suggested an immediate escalation or a prolonged buildup. In many cases like this, the physical environment often tells a silent version of events, one that either supports or contradicts what witnesses later describe. What makes this case particularly difficult is the emotional weight surrounding it. This was not a public space or a high-traffic environment. It was a private home, a place where events unfold away from outside observation. That means investigators rely heavily on forensic evidence and the accounts of those who were present. Authorities have confirmed that a juvenile suspect was taken into custody and charged with murder, but they have released very few additional details. That silence is not unusual in cases involving minors, where legal protections limit the amount of information that can be made public during an active investigation. Still, for the community and for those following the case, it creates a gap filled with questions. One of the central focuses for investigators is the timeline leading up to the discovery of Katheryn Bigbee. The initial report began as a missing child situation within the home. That detail is significant because it suggests that at first, those inside did not immediately understand the severity of what had occurred. There was still uncertainty, still hope that the child might be located safely. But that uncertainty did not last. At some point during the search, the situation shifted. The realization that Katheryn was not simply missing but in serious danger changed the urgency of the response. The move outside the home marked the beginning of the discovery that would ultimately confirm the worst fears of the family. Investigators believe that whatever occurred happened within a relatively short time frame. In many domestic or household-related homicides involving minors, incidents often unfold quickly, sometimes within minutes. That is why reconstructing the exact sequence is so critical. A difference of even a few minutes can completely change the understanding of intent, opportunity, and escalation. At this point in the investigation, forensic analysis becomes central. Experts would be examining physical evidence to determine the nature of the injuries, the location where the fatal event occurred, and whether there was any movement of individuals after the incident. These details help establish whether the event was confined to one area or spread across multiple parts of the home. At the same time, detectives would be analyzing statements from those present. Inconsistencies between accounts are not necessarily indicators of wrongdoing. They can also reflect trauma, confusion, or shock. But they are still carefully reviewed because they can help refine the timeline and identify moments that require further examination. The involvement of a juvenile suspect adds another layer of complexity. Legally, cases involving minors follow a different framework than adult homicide cases. There are restrictions on disclosure, differences in how interviews are conducted, and heightened attention to psychological evaluation. Investigators must balance the need for information with the responsibility to protect the legal rights of a child. Despite these limitations, one fact remains central. Authorities believe they have identified the individual responsible for Katheryn's death. That conclusion is based on early evidence collected at the scene and subsequent investigative steps, though the exact nature of that evidence has not been made public. Outside the investigative process, the impact on the community continues to deepen. At Piedmont Elementary School, Katheryn's absence is not just noted, it is felt in every routine moment that once included her presence. Teachers are left navigating grief in real time, while students are confronted with a type of loss that is difficult for even adults to fully process. In situations like this, schools often become the center of emotional response. Counselors are brought in, support systems are activated, and efforts are made to help children understand and cope with what has happened. But no structured response can fully replace what has been lost. For the family, the reality is even more devastating. They're left with the confirmed loss of a child under circumstances that remain under investigation, and the knowledge that the situation unfolded within their own home, an environment that should have represented safety above all else. As investigators continue their work, they're also likely exploring if there were any prior indicators that could have signaled risk. In juvenile cases, especially those involving violence, there was often an effort to understand whether behavioral changes, prior incidents, or external influences played any role in the escalation. However, no official information has been released suggesting a known history of violence or prior warnings. At this stage, much is remaining under review, and conclusions are still being carefully formed based on evidence rather than speculation. What is clear is that the case has moved beyond the initial shock phase and into a detailed, methodical investigation aimed at answering the most difficult question of all. How did this happen inside a home involving two children in a way that ended in irreversible loss? And as investigators work toward that answer, they're also aware that not every detail may ever be fully understood in a way that satisfies public expectation. Some cases, especially those involving minors in private settings, remain partially closed even after legal proceedings conclude. But what will remain is the impact, the loss of a young life, the disruption of a community, and the questions that will continue to follow those who lived through the day everything changed. Because in Piedmont, April 17th did not end as an ordinary day. It ended as the beginning of an investigation that is still trying to explain how innocence, conflict, and tragedy collided inside a single home, and why it happened at all.